Let's have a look at this question. How far do you agree that in the years 1945 to 79 immigration and its impact changed significantly? When you sit down and have a look at this question, you first of all need to decide which second order concept it's targeting. So if we think about our list of 5, it could be a consequence question, significance, causation, similarity and difference, or change and continuity. This question is asking about change and continuity. Did it change significantly or did it stay the same? So now we've identified that it's a change in continuity question, we need to think about how we are going to evaluate change in continuity in terms of immigration over this time period. The examiner's report did highlight that you could tackle this chronologically. But if you did tackle it chronologically, chances are you're going to be restricted to level 3 in the mark scheme because you're inevitably going to be drawn into doing a narrative or descriptive account of what happened with immigration over this time period. So instead, you need to think of a criteria for evaluating how immigration changed over this time period. So you might want to stop the video now and have a think about how you could evaluate that change over time. Because this is a change in continuity question, one way of thinking about it would be to think about, well, I'm going to have 3 paragraphs and here are my 3 judgment lines. We've done this quite often in class. So in each of the categories, the criteria, was there more change or more continuity? So the criteria that I've come up with for this one is to think about, well, did the number of immigrants change over this time period or was there more continuity? How did government attitudes change and how did social attitudes change? And I'm just going to do a really quick judgment as part of my plan to get me thinking evaluatively. So I might want to say that the number of immigrants changed pretty significantly over this time period, and we'll go into a bit more detail in that in a moment. So this is where I think there is the greatest change over this time period. However, with government attitudes, as you'll see, I'm going to say that actually there's quite a lot of continuity in government attitudes. Particularly, you could argue there's a lot of welcoming to immigrants between this time period, and that maybe the negativity with the outliers, people like Enoch Powell, the mainstream of government attitudes tended to be more welcoming towards immigration. And then if we think about social attitudes, I'm going to say, well, yeah, there was quite a lot of change in social attitudes as the number of immigrants increased over this time period. Now, when we think about the top levels, we've got to think about how we might want to build in some nuance here. And just having a think, we could say, well, one of the nuances that might be applicable might be regional differences, because where immigrants settled when they arrived in Britain, there's regional variation, and that obviously has a knock-on impact on social attitudes. So it's not even across the country. And also, there are waves of immigration, so it's not an evenly placed impact across this time period. There's a rapid increase in immigration from 1948 up until about 1968, and then it tends to slow down as we're going into the 1970s. So there's 2 ways that we can think about building in nuance. So that's my quick plan that I might have done under time conditions, and now we're going to think about how we could build in a bit more detail. Now, you wouldn't have time to do this. This is where your revision comes into play. Before we have a look at that though, let's just have a look about this is a real answer that was given by a student in the 2022 exams. And it could be strengthened, but they have identified a criteria. So it could certainly be argued that in the years 1945 to 79, immigration and its impact changed significantly. So good focus on the question. As it was a period of significant growth with the Commonwealth Immigration Act and governments attempting to improve race relations. However, it could also be argued its impact hadn't changed due to continuity in racism people faced. So really clear focus on change and continuity. They've identified that. There is a bit of judgment in there too. And they've given us a criteria, although it's somewhat implied it could be strengthened, but we've got about growth in immigration numbers, we've got how the government responded to that, and we've also got about social attitudes with the racism people face. So we have got our 3 criteria established in this intro. And this intro was written by a candidate who was marked at level 5. One of the aspects that all candidates need to really focus on is creating really strong opening sentences, because that will drive the analysis and it will move you away from those level 3 descriptive narrative answers. So in this case, however, it could also be argued that while the 1948 Act had a significant impact on Britain, it did not help to change racist attitudes that continued on from the past. So here we've got a clear argument that that racist attitudes, there was some continuity there. So building into the evidence, some of the things you might want to think about for the paragraph on the number of immigrants. Well, the change starts with the 1948 British Nationality Act. Then we've got some nice statistics about how the number of people born outside the UK goes from 4.3% in 1951 to 6.4% in 1971, although you could argue that's not a vast increase. One of the changes, though, definitely you might want to mention is where immigrants are coming from. Initially, in the second wave of immigration, it was coming from the Caribbean, what were described as new Commonwealth countries, or otherwise known as the Windrush generation until 1958, and then increasingly from India and Pakistan. But we talked about building in nuance, and by 1968 the numbers had been restricted to 1,500 per year. So that change starts to slow down as we get into the late 1960s and definitely going into the 1970s. You could say that there's some continuity in this time period, that the impact of the number of immigrants is not evenly distributed throughout the country. So there is a lot of change in some areas of the country. A good example is London, Brixton. A lot of the immigrants coming on the Windrush generation, they centred in Brixton because it was near the Labour Exchange. So that was for practicality reasons. But from a vast swathe of the country, there was continuity because they didn't see the impact of immigration. My second paragraph about government attitudes, well, you could say some of the change is that it moves, there's a shift from controlling immigration, or you could say for welcoming immigration, to then controlling immigration and then moving into race relations. But in terms of continuity, you could say there's always evidence of some resistance to immigration. We saw it in the lesson in the 1950 Cabinet Papers. You could see it with Enoch Powell. You could see it with Peter Griffiths. I mean, you could argue that that's primarily coming from Enoch Powell, Peter Griffiths. They're both Conservative MPs. So you could say it's the outliers of the Conservative Party. But you could also create an argument that there's quite a lot of continuity in terms of welcoming immigrants. We saw it in 1948 with the British Nationality Act to help rebuild Britain. But also in 1972, we've got another example of Ugandan immigrants who had been expelled by Idi Amin being welcomed into Britain. Finally, the third paragraph is about social attitudes. Well, the change might come increasingly by the time we get into the 1970s. There is a white backlash. But equally, you could say that there is evidence of resistance throughout this time period. So I've picked up a couple of case studies. We've got the Smethwick election, Notting Hill riots, the London Dockers marching for Enoch Powell. You could develop a bit of nuance here, saying that there were different class attitudes to immigration. The Teddy Boys 1950s are an example of working class resistance to immigration. And you could say that there's an element of continuity because despite the legislative changes in terms of race relations, it had very limited impact on the day-to-day level for immigrants, and there were still no-go areas for a lot of immigrants in a lot of inner city areas of Britain.